All right, it looks like we are live. So, Stephen, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. I don't know how much you want to know, but I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. Um, Married for over 50 years. I've taught philosophy for over 50 years at a number of schools, including my alma mater, Wheaton College, and St. Olaf College, Calvin University, and the last 20 years at Baylor. Just accepted a part-time position at the University of Notre Dame in Australia. So, what else? Let's see. My PhD is from Yale. I work in ethics, both meta ethics and virtue ethics, philosophy of religion, philosophy of psychology, philosophical theology. Um, what else? Oh, Kierkegaard is a big thing of mine. I do a lot of work on Kierkegaard. I've written quite a few books on him. I'm working right now on the new revised version of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Kierkegaard. So
Awesome.
just my next book is going to be a book called Living Accountably, which is about thinking of accountability as a virtue rather than simply thinking of accountability in terms of punishing someone who's done something wrong.
Awesome. So, I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe that there's no evidence for God or that everything is best explained by naturalism. Could you tell me some of the reasons you believe there are for belief in a God?
Well, uh, there there's a lot to be said about that. My views on what we might call natural religious knowledge are spelled out in my book, Natural Signs and Knowledge of God, which was with Oxford a few years back. And there's a sort of dispute or a difference in among theistic philosophers about how the knowledge of God comes about. One school of thought, very influenced by Alvin Plantinga, accepts Reformed epistemology, which is the idea that we have a kind of natural uh, instinct to believe in God, and that this is a reliable sort of truth-aimed faculty. The other school of thought is evidentialism, which thinks that belief in God is based on evidence. The Plantinga, the Reformed epistemology view, thinks that belief in God could be a basic view. So it might have some sort of ground in terms of how the view is produced, but it isn't based on any kind of evidence, so it doesn't require arguments. My own view is somewhat charitable or ecumenical in that I sort of claim that both views are correct. I think there is evidence, and that evidence can be uh, important in coming to believe in God. But I also think that what I call natural signs, which can be made into evidence, you can reflect on them and they become propositional evidence. But I think these natural signs can be part of what we might call the Plantingian process, that is, the process by which these sort of natural beliefs in God come about. So I think both sides have something to be said. So I don't think that it's necessary to have arguments or evidence to have a reasonable belief in God, but I don't think I also think that it is possible to have a reasonable belief that is based on evidence. So that's a brief summary of my view. Uh, I think that there is the claim that belief in God is natural is one that is increasingly has, you might say, scientific empirical evidence on its side. It used to be said and thought that belief in God was something purely cultural, that it was sort of just something we learn as we grow up. But now cognitive psychologists, including atheists, are pretty convinced that believing in God or something like God is hardwired into us, that it's natural and instinctive. That doesn't mean, of course, that those beliefs are true. They could be false. It could be that evolution has played us a little trick and given us a tendency to believe things that have some sort of survival value, even though they aren't correct. But if the theistic view that God has implanted this is correct, you would at least say the scientific evidence is what one would expect to be the case. So it's more compatible, you might say, with a theistic picture than the older picture, which was that all religious beliefs are learned and the product of culture. So,
Awesome. So, a few things there. My position on Plantinga's properly basic beliefs is that I don't understand how that works epistemically. So, it seems like you could argue anything as a properly basic belief. If you believe it is somehow fundamental to reality, then you could argue that whatever that belief happens to be, you call it properly basic, and then it becomes justified based on the reformed epistemology that Plantinga espouses. So it seems to me that that's not a very reliable way to differentiate imagination from reality, and it can essentially be used to justify any belief you hold as being rational simply because you hold it.
well, the issues here are very deep, and they have to do with fundamental differences in epistemology. So, and they're not just bare. Interestingly, uh, Plantinga is what is called an externalist in his epistemology. Externalism thinks that our warranted or justified beliefs are not necessarily beliefs that we can cite evidence for, but rather they are produced in a reliable way by some sort of reliable process. Now, interestingly enough, externalism as an epistemology was pretty much invented by and championed by atheists, because externalism seems to fit very well with the view that animals have knowledge, because they don't have the kind of reflective capacity. Other animals besides human animals have knowledge because they don't have the kind of reflective capacities we do. And so it seems reasonable to think that knowledge can be the result of some sort of natural process, without necessarily the person who has the knowledge being able to explain how they got the knowledge. Otherwise, animals wouldn't have knowledge, and animals surely do. So this was actually a view invented by atheists. Now, it's true, Plantinga puts it to use in philosophy of religion, but one of the features of externalism in general, not just Plantinga's feature, is that externalism always means that in the end, uh, you have something like a circular appeal. So, for example, how do we justify perception or memory? Well, you would think, you might say, well, it's because they work pretty well. Perception is reliable. Most of the beliefs we form through perception are true. Most of the beliefs, although clearly not all of them, that we form from memory are true. But if you think about it for a moment, you'll see that that's obviously a circular or question-begging justification. Because how do we know most of what we believe by perception and memory are true? We have to rely on perception and memory. So externalism cheerfully sort of embraces that, and sort of says, well, we're not godlike beings, we're animals. And so we have to put up with the fact that we don't have that kind of Cartesian certainty or infallibility with respect to our beliefs. So the question in the end with respect to any claim about this will always be one, um, if you're, for example, if you're a Berkeleyan idealist and you don't believe in matter, you might deny that perception gives us knowledge of matter. Uh, the Berkeleyan can probably consistently hold that view, and you can't really, I think, prove the Berkeleyan wrong without some sort of question-begging appeal to the fact that we actually do experience matter, the material world, when we go out and look around ourselves. So obviously, yeah, one could always take an epistemology and make it, use it for an absurd cause, but in the end, you'll have to say, just as you would for perception or memory, does this process reliably work? If it does, then maybe we get knowledge or justified beliefs out of it. If it's not reliable, but there's no way of saying whether it's reliable or not without, you might say, uh, looking at our first order beliefs about things. In other words, here's the way I would put it. Another divide in epistemology is between the people that I call Methodists and the people that I call particularists. That terminology comes from Roderick Chisholm. Methodists have nothing to do with the church, the Methodist Church. the idea is that a Methodist says if you're going to have any real knowledge of any kind or warranted belief, you must first justify that by showing that it comes about through some sort of reliable method. While particularists say, how do we know a method is reliable? Well, we have to first test the method by seeing if it gives us the right answers and justifying the beliefs that we know are true or know that think we know. So particularists say we don't start with method, we start with particular beliefs. And that's why probably something like Reformed epistemology is pretty worthless as apologetics. That's not what it's designed to do. Apologetics is an attempt to give arguments or evidence that would convince someone, and that's not what Plantinga is trying to do. He's simply trying to argue that if there is a God, then the people who believe in God in the properly basic way are reasonable and justified in doing so. So in order to show that that's wrong, the burden of proof, you might say, is on the atheist. The atheist has to show not just, I mean, here's the way to put it. Many people might say, well, I don't know whether there's a God or not. How could I tell something like that? It's mysterious. But I do know there's not any good evidence. There's no way to reasonably, and without good evidence, belief in God isn't reasonable. Plantinga shows, I think, pretty convincingly that that claim is wrong. That one could, if there is a God, one could believe in God reasonably without basing that belief on any kind of arguments or evidence. And that means then that someone who it doesn't mean that someone has to believe in God because they've read Plantinga, but it does mean if they're going to accuse the believer of being irrational or unreasonable, then they have to know that there is no God or have very strong evidence for that. So it isn't just a matter of saying, well, I don't know if there's a God, but you can't believe without really good evidence. On the Plantingian view, you really need strong evidence against belief in God. And Plantinga does admit that that's possible, that what a claim that a belief is true and it's known in a properly basic way is subject to defeat. It could be overturned because we might have strong evidence against it, or it might be incompatible with other things. Anyway, it's that's sort of what Plantinga is all about. But I don't think Plantinga really has anything against giving arguments. He actually inspired a book called 24 or So Arguments. You probably know the book. I haven't argued in that book myself.
Well, the part I don't really understand is that I agree with the position that you stated earlier, the referencing what atheists believe is that if there's no evidence, it's irrational to believe in a God. And Plantinga's view, which rejects that, doesn't seem to make sense to me because the basis he uses to claim it's rational, the properly basic beliefs, that methodology seems very unreliable. Even if we grant we can't show there's anything more than just our conscious experience. We don't know if there's matter or idealism is true or whatever. If we grant that we're trying to measure the quality of different kinds of methodologies in their ability to tell us something about what we experience, whether or not those things are true. The starting with beliefs that you hold does not seem to be very good at telling us anything about the future of what we're going to experience. It doesn't give us any insight into future experiences, whereas something like science or novel predictions is very good at giving us insight into the future experiences we're going to have. And so it seems like that methodology is a far more reasonable methodology to use than one that just says, I'm going to accept my properly basic beliefs, whatever they may be, because that methodology seems to allow in anything you want. It would be like people are rational to believe in leprechauns if there are leprechauns. People are rational to believe in unicorns if there are unicorns. People are rational to believe in round squares if there are round squares. It seems like that methodology is just can be used for literally anything, and so it's not a good method to establish reasonability.
Well, it's essentially the same kind of a method that is used by externalist epistemologists, including atheists, to justify perception and memory. So there's nothing wrong with the method per se, I think. The only problems might be, of course, any method can be misused, but how shall I put this? I suppose if you really thought that there were leprechauns and you thought you had well-justified beliefs and you'd seen lots of leprechauns and so on, then you might give a parallel argument, and you'd think, and in some sense, you could say, yes, anything, you could try to justify anything. But of course, most of us would say, no, that's no good because there aren't any leprechauns. And we think that a leprechaun is the sort of thing one would need evidence to have. I should say here, just my own view of how the what we might call the dialectical situation, where things stand. I think many people and many atheists tend to think that the dialectical situation is something like this. They say, look, all of us look around us, we see rocks and trees and grass and people and animals of various kinds and rivers and water, and we all believe in those things. And then the religious believer in God adds to that something new. It's like believing in the Loch Ness Monster or believing in Santa Claus or in Bigfoot or Yeti, or something like that. And you would think if that's the case, if God is sort of one more thing you're adding to your ontology, then the burden of proof is on the theist. Why? You would think then atheism is a less risky belief, because the atheist just sort of contents himself with believing in all the things that we believe, while the theists believe in, quote, one more thing. But I think that description of the dialectical situation is wrong, because God is not one more thing. Believing in God or not believing in God is not at all like believing in the Loch Ness Monster or not believing in the Loch Ness Monster. Because if God exists at all, God is not one more thing in the universe. He is the foundation of everything else that exists in the universe. So it seems to me that there are two sort of equally risky beliefs here. The theist and the atheist don't just disagree about God, they disagree about everything. They disagree about, because the theist believes that everything that exists in this world has the property of existing because of God and only because of God, such that if God withdrew his sustaining presence for a second, everything would collapse into the nothingness it would be otherwise. While the atheist says, no, everything that exists just has this property of existing on its own, so to speak. It doesn't need any support or. So metaphysically, they both have a disagreement about every entity, not just about one entity. And then the question will be, which of those two metaphysical views seems most reasonable? And there's a lot of ways of trying to dice that up and slice it. But I think there is evidence. I think, for example, moral arguments for theism are quite powerful. I'm the author myself of the Stanford Encyclopedia article on moral arguments. I think there's a variety of moral arguments that they have a lot of force. For the 24 or so arguments book, I wrote an article on what I call the argument from design for ordinary people. That doesn't, it's not an argument that depends on fine tuning or any particular scientific theory, but it rather relies on what I would call our natural instinctive tendency to see the world as purposive, which is something that's pretty hard to stamp out. Notice that when somebody's trying to sell you something, say some cosmetics or hairspray or something, they always say it's natural. It's natural ingredients. We tend to think that things are natural are better because they are somehow suited or fitting, or they have some sort of teleology. So that's obviously not an infallible claim. I could be wrong about that. But on my view, the evidence for God really should be like that. It should consist of signs which have the following two characteristics. I call these the Pascalian constraints on religious knowledge. The first constraint is that the evidence for God, if it is based on evidence, should be widely accessible. You shouldn't have to have a PhD in philosophy or an understanding of, say, relativity physics to grasp the evidence. But the second constraint, which I think is equally important, is that the evidence ought to be resistible. That is, that it's not, God, I think, is not interested in compelling or forcing people by giving them overwhelming evidence, but rather he leaves us in a sort of epistemically ambiguous situation, such that there are pointers, there are clues, so that those who want to believe in God, who think that the world, the universe would be a better place if there were a God, can do that. But those who don't feel that way can also do that. And I think that's because God is not interested in, so to speak, he wants friends who want to be his friends voluntarily. And so if they don't value God or value the idea that God would make the world a better place, God doesn't really want them to believe in him.
So my initial thoughts are like, it's possible for people to rationalize belief in the flat earth. Like maybe all of their science is in the matrix, and so science doesn't have the correct way to assess that actually the world is flat and we're in a computer program. That's why it looks round. But the more rational belief seems to be like, yeah, the world's round. And I think the same thing applies to properly basic beliefs and to design inferences, or our feeling that things have purpose, our feeling that things have design. It seems like the better explanation there is that those are evolutionary tendencies that lead to fallacious reasoning in lots of different contexts of life. Like we know of the type 1 and type 2 errors, the fact that when we see a rustle in the bushes, we think it's a lion, and that group of people who thought it was a lion ran away and survived, and so they were more likely to reproduce. And so that hyperactive agency detection system was more prevalent in different surviving species than the lack of that thing. And so that belief seems to be analogous to the evidence the world is round. It's a very rational conclusion to make. You could, however, say that, well, actually, no, there are really things there, spirits, gods, whatever, and that this belief isn't just a product of evolution, but it does actually tie into something more fundamental in reality. But you could say the same thing about flat Earth. You could say maybe their intuition that the world is really flat does tie into something like we're in the matrix, and outside of the matrix the world is really flat. But that doesn't seem to be like a rational conclusion. And the same with properly basic beliefs. It seems like the properly basic beliefs are better explained by the evolutionary hypothesis. And so the fact that you could explain these in a different way doesn't seem to add to them being rational in any way. And you mentioned that God isn't adding another thing because he's the fundamental nature of reality. To me, that seems worse than adding another thing. It's like adding an infinite number of things, which makes your hypothesis even less reasonable, not more reasonable. So to me, my question is why would we accept these as being more rational when they are added in such a huge claim, when it seems like the better hypothesis is the evolutionary one to explain the data?
Well, I just don't see the evolutionary hypothesis as in any way in competition. I mean, I'm fully on board with evolutionary theory. I don't see any problem with believing that God has chosen to make the world through an evolutionary process. So the fact that an evolutionary explanation can be given of some mental process doesn't really say anything or imply anything about whether that process is truth-oriented. Presumably, one could, for example, give an evolutionary explanation of our capacities to do mathematics. But I wouldn't want to say, well, you can't accept mathematics because we only have these capacities because they came about through evolution. You wouldn't want to dismiss or reject that human faculty. So I think you need more than just the fact that one can give an evolutionary explanation. One needs to show that the evolutionary explanation is incompatible with a theistic. In general, see, I think one of the strengths of a theistic view is that, and I frankly, I'll just say, I have a hard time understanding atheists on this point, because it seems to me that in principle, a natural explanation of anything could never compete with or lessen the value of a theistic metaphysical account. So if you're comparing theism and atheism, you have to look at both of them on the metaphysical level. You can't wrap yourself in the flag of science and say, well, I'm just going with science, because the disagreement here is not whether science is reliable. It's how do we interpret science and how do we understand the natural world? And science itself doesn't tell us that. That's philosophy. That's metaphysics. So the arguments have to be put at that level. And that's why I say that the atheist view is equally risky. I don't say that it's more risky. I say they're equally risky, that there's no special burden of proof on either the theist or the atheist on my account.
Well, that's the thing I have a question about, because to me it seems like we don't have to create a competing theory to rule out leprechauns. Like we could say a guy says a leprechaun knocked over that cup, and I say it was probably the wind, and we can show there's lots of evidence of the wind and different pressure differentials in the air that caused this. I'm like, yeah, that's good evidence. But you'd be like, well, that doesn't compete with the leprechaun theory, because the leprechaun could have caused the wind. So the fact that the wind can be shown to knock over the cup, well, that the wind could have been caused by a leprechaun. And so you can always push back the theory, essentially a God of the gaps kind of a thing, where we've explained it naturally, but that doesn't overtly compete with this other hypothesis that could explain all of those things. And so it just keeps being pushed back and back and back. And it seems again like you could do that with anything. And so I don't think we need a competing hypothesis or to show that evolution would rule out a God. More that if that is sufficient, we don't need to add anything else, or adding anything else is a weaker hypothesis until independent evidence is provided for that thing. Just saying that it caused all of these other things that we do have good evidence for seems ad hoc in a sense.
Well, I guess I'm saying I don't think you quite have taken my point on board, because a leprechaun would be one more thing in the natural world. It would be like finding a new species or a new type of animal. But that's not the case when we're talking about God. So the view or the claim that there's a God would be something like, let's say, there are rival metaphysical views. There's naturalistic atheism, there's pantheism, there's panpsychism, there's axiarchism, which is a kind of non-theistic Platonism. Those are all rival metaphysical accounts. It seems to me that they all have to be argued. Now, if it could be shown that one of those views was incompatible with science, or that something in science made that view less probable or less likely, then that would be a heavy criticism of that view. But I see nothing in science. And as you, I'm sure, must know, many of the greatest scientists, both historically and today, are religious believers.
Sure, but my question is more like the Matrix. Like we can say that all of the things we see is explained by the fact we're in the Matrix and it's all programmed to look this way. But that doesn't seem to be a plausible reason to believe in the Matrix. The fact that you can explain all of the data with the Matrix doesn't give us a reason to believe we're in the Matrix, because infinitely many hypotheses can explain all of the data. So the best metaphysical hypothesis that I think would be to take, or the most rational one to take, would be the one that essentially only uses combinations of things that we have reason to believe are in our scientific data, or in the world we experience around us. And if you add anything else, any properties that haven't been demonstrated within this natural world that we have access to, then that's a worse hypothesis than one that only uses combinations of things that we've demonstrated in this natural world that we have access to. So like saying the origin of the universe was string theory, or the many world hypothesis, those seem rational to me because they're all of the parts in the theory have been demonstrated in reality. The multiverse hypothesis is a combination of early universe inflation, which was demonstrated in observations in the CMB, and virtual particles demonstrated in the Casimir effect. You combine the math in those two things, poof, you get the multiverse. So all of the parts of the multiverse have a good evidential scientific basis in our reality. But if you add in a different hypothesis, like a God, many of the properties of God, or maybe you don't like properties if you think he's one thing, but the omniscience, omnibenevolence, omnipotence, eternal, outside of space-time and matter, a mind outside of space-time and matter, none of those things seem to have any plausible evidential basis in reality, whereas all of the parts of the multiverse do. And so as a metaphysical theory, the multiverse one seems to be a significantly better one than adding in these new properties that we have no evidence for. It seems like that would be like adding in the leprechaun.
Well, a multiverse, again, I take it, is a scientific theory, and so it's not the same kind of theory. If you want to compare theism to its rivals, you have to compare it to rivals. Of course, as a scientific theory, I'm actually agnostic on the multiverse. I'm open to it. It would be fine if that's the true view, but I don't know if it is. I haven't made up my mind about that. I think scientifically the jury is still out. There are different ways of interpreting relativity and lots of things. But whatever the case may be about that, it seems to me theism would be unshaken. If there is a multiverse or if there isn't, won't matter at all. Now, what would matter would be if one could show, for example, that anti-realism about value is true, that there are no facts about values, because I think naturalism has great trouble explaining moral realism of any kind. Uh, One might ask whether or not we have good explanations for, say, things like the stability of the natural laws, and something like, why does induction work so well? Why is it that the world continues, that the laws of nature don't change, but they seem stable and fixed? Um, there are lots of human capacities. And if you believe, you may not believe this, you might be an anti-realist about ethics, but if you think that, for example, humans have what Kant called dignity, a kind of equal value that all humans possess just because they're humans, how does one explain that? I don't think naturalism could explain that at all. So when I mentioned Plantinga earlier, I didn't mean to suggest in any way that there isn't evidence, but the evidence has to be understood uh, as philosophical evidence. Uh, but both the atheist and the theist here have to argue philosophically. And science itself isn't going to decide the question, because you can't provide scientific evidence that the only things that can be known are the things that science knows. That's not a claim that could be tested scientifically, and so it can't be defended scientifically.
Well, sure, I would agree. I would just think that whatever metaphysical view you want to take, the best metaphysical view is going to be the one that adds the least difference to science, because I think science is the most reliable source of knowledge we have. And because of that, the more you diverge away from that, the less rational a theory is. And I think that the multiverse is, you can take the multiverse to be a metaphysical position. Naturalism, as in material naturalism, that's just a version of that. So it can be a version of a metaphysical theory, and say that, so I'm going to take the metaphysical theory of naturalism being the multiverse version, and that to me seems significantly more rational than adding in other things like non-physical minds or different kinds of personalities. But I am a moral realist, so I do agree there. And I think I'm a moral naturalist. It also has a nice page on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So I think that the things you mentioned, the patterns in human nature, the morality, the consistency of the laws of nature, I think all of those can be explained equally as well on naturalism as they can under a God. Why do you think the God would do better on any of those?
Well, I think, I mean, I'd be interested to see what your accounts would be, but it seems to me that for the most part, naturalism has to view these things as brute, not to be explained. They're just facts. And most atheists I know who are moral realists tend to be moral non-naturalist. And non-naturalism, let's face it, if you're going to go if you're going to be a non-naturalist, now you say you're a naturalist, that's a different story. I know there are people like the Cornell realist who think, but lots of atheist philosophers that I could cite, and you probably could too, do think that there are moral truths that are not natural truths. So already naturalism as a metaphysical view is exploded if that's true. Uh, Leaving God out of the picture. You don't need God. So take someone like Dworkin, for example, who passed away a few years ago. His last book is called Religion Without God. And I think Dworkin was a very great philosopher, and I admired him very much. And basically, his view was that naturalism is false. There's no God, but there is still some sort of metaphysical reality that's non-personal, that he had a kind of religious character for him. So he considered himself a religious man, even though he rejected the idea that there was some sort of personal God on things. So there's tons of people who would say that the question. I mean, the question of whether the multiverse is true or not is one question. The other question is whether the universe, whatever it be, is the whole of reality, and whether the entities that we discover using, say, the scientific method are the only entities there are. And those claims cannot, in principle, be decided by science or by any scientific theory. Whether the multiverse is true or not won't make any difference whatsoever.
Well, sure, but my question is still, why would we think that God is a better explanation than naturalism in these cases? Because it seems like to me, naturalism is a better explanation here because it uses a combination of things we know and have very good reason to believe exist without adding any extra entities that don't seem to have any good evidence that they exist. And it seems like when you do add extra entities, that inherently makes the hypothesis worse.
Well, another way of looking or evaluating metaphysical claims would be in terms of simplicity. And if you have millions or maybe billions of brute facts, that's going to be a very unsimple view. And one could argue that theism has only one brute fact, namely God. So it's by far the most simple and elegant theory. So on that criterion, theism easily would win, I think. But there, basically, I'm just repeating myself now, so we're kind of going back and forth, not
I do
really.
have a question about the brute facts thing. So to me, it seems like if you take God and say he's one brute fact, and I take all of the brute facts in the universe, it seems like I could compress those all into one essence of the universe and say it's just one brute fact also. Because each of the different ways the universe could be, there could potentially be a God who wanted the universe to be that way. So for each of the different variations of the possible combination of brute facts that could encapsulate the universe, there is a God who could want that combination of facts of the universe. And so it seems like I could essentially say that there is one intertwining law of physics that is the one brute fact of every universe, and it determines all the other things. And that would essentially get us to an equal playing field of having one brute fact that determines all the different laws of physics, and those would be a result of this brute fact. And so I don't see a fundamental difference between the God hypothesis here and the naturalist hypothesis here. But again, because I'm positing an extra law of physics, which has some basis in reality, that still seems better than a non-physical mind of some kind.
Well, there are all kinds of issues here. One issue is this. Uh, I don't know what your metaphysical view of laws of nature is, but I think the majority view among Western philosophers historically has been that laws of nature are contingent and not necessary. That's why we need evidence for scientific laws. If they were necessary truths, or then we perhaps could know them by reason or a priori, but we don't know them that way. So if they are contingent, then it doesn't seem like there is some necessary law that. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe most philosophers are wrong. Maybe the laws of nature are all necessary. In which case maybe you could be right. There could be some super law that is the foundational law for everything, and maybe the whole of the universe in that case. I mean, we could really think. I suppose we could go back to Spinoza and say that we have one absolute brute being, and it has a kind of divine character because it's necessary and self-existent, and those are the characteristics of God. So that doesn't sound like naturalism to me. It sounds more like Spinozist pantheism.
Well, I'd be happy with that. I'd just get rid of the consciousness. So as long as you got rid of the consciousness aspect of God and just had the other parts, the omnipotence, eternality, or outside of time, or whatever, that would still seem like a better, simpler theory than the God hypothesis. And it seems like it can explain all of the data equally or better than the God hypothesis. So
Yeah.
why posit consciousness has anything to do with this? Because it doesn't seem to do any epistemic work here. It doesn't. We don't need it.
Well, consciousness, in my view, is one of the huge problems with naturalism. That and moral value and morality, because it seems to me that most. I actually taught a course once in philosophy of mind, which I argued against materialist views of the mind, and I only had the students read materialist because there are all these rival materialist theories and they're completely incompatible, and they all have devastating objections that they make against each other. So one doesn't even have to argue for the view for dualism or anything like that. One can just let the materialists make the case. So central state materialist and functionalist and all these other kinds of views. So I think consciousness is a real problem, and any view that denies the existence of consciousness seems to me to be almost a philosophical absurdity. So
Oh, I would agree, but I don't think we need consciousness to be in the necessary thing. I don't think the necessary thing needs to be conscious. So I agree that we haven't solved consciousness yet, and it exists. I think I'm conscious. I'm not like an eliminativist or anything like that. But I think that that unknown, the fact that it's an unknown, doesn't lend weight to either hypothesis here. It's just something we haven't solved yet. And I don't think it adds anything to say the necessary thing must have consciousness in it anywhere.
well, it certainly, I don't claim that this is any sort of deductive argument or proof, but one could say that the existence of conscious beings in a world that was created by a conscious being is certainly not surprising, especially if part of the purposes of God's creating the world was to make possible some sort of creatures with whom he could have a relationship of friendship. So that again, you might say theism would be a view that would be more likely to predict conscious beings, would be a part of the scene. Uh, there are other explanations. We can go the panpsychist route, and that view seems to be gaining a lot of traction these days. More, but panpsychism also shares the intuition with the theists that somehow consciousness must be part of the ground floor, so to speak. If we're going to explain consciousness, it must be part of the basic character of reality. So I think theism is more plausible than panpsychism myself, but I can see the argument for panpsychism.
Well, I don't understand the argument of how simply we don't understand something, therefore let's put that thing in the fundamental nature of reality is a good argument. To me, it seems
It's
like
not an argument from mystery or anything like that. Uh, it's it's simply an argument that consciousness has a particular character, and it does seem surprising. I mean, even lots of atheists find consciousness surprising. Well, it's sort of there, and if we think that it is some sort of clue to the character of the universe, to the basic character, then it might support panpsychism or God. We're not talking about an explanation of how consciousness works scientifically. Presumably, someday we'll come up with that, but we don't have it now. But I think that even if we have some sort of natural explanation of how consciousness works, how does it that the brain uh, produces conscious states, and clearly there is some sort of a physiological basis for consciousness. I certainly wouldn't deny that, but that's still not the same thing. It looks as if I think Chalmers is right. We can easily imagine that evolution would have selected for zombies whose brains would have done all the work of consciousness without consciousness, and but we have consciousness, so. Uh,
well, I still don't understand why we would think this tells us about the fundamental nature of reality. It seems like the reason people say that the particular nature of consciousness is indicative of the fundamental nature of reality is simply because we haven't come up with a way to explain it with the combinations of other things that we know about. So it seems to me like an argument for mystery in that they're saying we can't imagine any way for this to be emergent, therefore we're going to say it's fundamental.
well, we of course, all claims. I'm a fallibilist, and so I'd say every claim one makes is one could be wrong about. And uh, I, I, although I'm inclined to think that there's some sort of neurophysical mechanism that's involved in the production of consciousness, it doesn't seem to me likely or plausible that any physical account will be the final complete story there. And if that's so, that might say something important about reality itself.
Why
So,
would it be more rational to conclude that that's something about reality rather than something that we just don't know about the physical processes? Like, wouldn't it be more reasonable to say that we're missing something about some descriptions of the physical world, and then that's going to give us the solution to consciousness rather than to say it's a fundamental part of reality itself?
Well, I mean, one can say, I mean, there's actually a school. I'm sure you're aware, in philosophy of mind, there's a sort of group of people that are called somewhat humorously the New Mysterians, who say it's just a mystery, and we'll never understand it. Uh, but that's because somehow our brains are just not good enough to understand how brains work, and it's possible maybe that's true, but I would say why? It just doesn't seem very plausible to me. And so one can always write blank checks and say, oh, yes, the science of the future will give us a complete explanation of consciousness. But I don't see any reason to think that's true unless one already knows that naturalism is true. And then probably, but then that's a question begging sort of argument.
The way I see it is more that I know that physics can't describe like what matter is made of. It describes how it interacts. So we know there's something about physics we're missing, which is the essence of stuff. We can't just describe the essence of stuff yet. And I think that once we bridge that gap and we can in some way solve that problem, then that will also give us an insight into consciousness. So to me, there is this clear thing we're missing in physics, which I think we will be able to get to. And that new tool will probably be able to solve consciousness as well.
Well, you might be right, but I wouldn't bet on it. I'm
All
not a
right.
betting man, but if I were, I wouldn't bet on it.
Are there any other arguments or evidence you think are better explained by God than naturalism?
Well, uh, there are things like I mentioned, the fact that the world is an orderly world. It's a cosmos and not a chaos. That we have laws of nature. That induction works. That nature is uniform. We don't live on what you might call Bertrand Russell's cosmic chicken farm. Russell once compared, I think he says, imagine that uh, here we are in the world and we think that induction is always going to work, and that the nature is going to be uniform. And so our past experience will be a reliable guide to the future. But imagine a chicken on a chicken farm, and relying on induction, that the chicken sees the chicken farmer come out, uh, as the chicken farmers come out every night in the chicken's life to feed the chicken, and the chicken concludes, I'm going to get fed. But in fact, that night, the farmer comes out, cuts off the chicken's head, and the chicken gets fed to the people. Uh, so, how do we know we aren't living in the cosmic chicken farm, and that someday induction is just going to quit working? Well, we don't really know that, I suppose. We have no real evidence against it. But if there's a God, I think we have an explanation of why the world is, you might say, stable, and we don't have to just take that as a brute fact. But we can say something about the nature of the world in relationship to God's purposes in creation. So
To me, that would be
that's the sort of thing I would say. I would just say, I'm sure many of your listeners are going to be very unhappy with almost everything I'm saying, but if they want to see the arguments in more detail, in my book, Natural Science and Knowledge of God, I try to look at the classical theistic arguments, seeing them as embodying natural signs, but I give them what I take to be the strongest forms that one give. I think there are many other signs that point to God. For example, one interesting one is this: many people, including many atheists, have a sense that they are accountable for how they live their lives as a whole. I call that global accountability. Uh, if theism is true, then that sense is literally pointing to a truth. Uh, I was just part of a team that did a survey, and it's surprising how many people who don't believe in God still would say yes if you ask them, are you accountable for how you live your life as a whole? Uh, Someone like Dworkin, again, would be a good example.
Oh, sure. So the first thing was the laws of nature. To me, it seems like, again, we could just go back to the one brute fact of the essence that ties in all the other laws, one field that connects all the other fields. And that would explain the uniformity of nature. It's just a part of the way nature
Yeah.
is. And that would explain it in essentially the same way a God does. It's just as it's a part of God's nature to do it this way, it's a part of nature's nature to do it this way. And I don't see any fundamental difference between those two and the ability to explain the laws of nature, induction, and uniformity. And for morality, I think that I don't think God solves the problem of morality. I don't think he provides an objective basis of morality. I think that you would need something independent of a consciousness to do that. I think you would need some kind of non-conscious entity or object or being of some kind. And a better explanation to that would be the kinds of beings we know about that are like that, laws of physics,
Yeah.
fields.
I don't think God's will or his decisions explain all of morality. I distinguish between value and moral obligations or duties. And in my view, the moral law is an expression of God's will, and it's grounded in God's will. Although I'm not a voluntarist, I think that what God wills is determined by the good, and the good must be objective and not a basis of anybody's will. But I'm a Platonist about the good. So I think the good is real and transcendent, and it happens to be identical to God. That's surprising, perhaps, and Plato probably wouldn't have guessed that that would be the case. But there's a long tradition of Christian Platonism, and I'm happy to put myself in that view. So I would agree that there are aspects of morality that reflect necessity, but I think they reflect the necessity of God's own character and reality. And then when God gives us his laws, I think they are necessarily directed at the good. So there's nothing arbitrary about them. They have to be constrained. If God were not essentially and necessarily good, then there would be no reason to obey God. We would have no obligation to obey him. On my
So I would agree with most of that, but I'd say that if you characterize God in that way, then you don't need God's consciousness to ground morality because it's grounded in his nature, and his nature isn't determined by his consciousness. His consciousness is determined by his nature. And so just as this is a consciouslessness grounds of morality, you can have a consciouslessness grounds of morality in some field of nature. You don't need the conscious mind anymore. And so if that's the way you want to ground morality outside of a decision-based consciousness, well, we can do that in naturalism too, just by saying it's some kind of a field. Why posit the God at this point? Because we can do it the same way with a simpler hypothesis.
Well, I would say that that's partially my view. I do think that obligations and the moral law, which is something distinct from the good, is grounded because I think it just makes sense. All I think obligations are grounded in some sort of social relationship. So if I join the Kiwanis Club, I have to pay dues. If I get married, I take on certain obligations. If I'm a citizen of a state, I have certain obligations. So I think obligations are always a matter of somebody somewhere has some sort of standing such that that person can rightfully expect and require something of you and blame you if you don't do that. So I think in order to have a moral law, we need to have someone who can play that role. Now, you might think, well, we can do it ourselves. That's Kant's view. Or we could go with a social contract view. Darwell has this idea that the moral community is what holds us accountable. But I think all those views are subject to rather severe criticisms, and I think God works better as the explanation of moral obligation. I think God also explains the good, but he explains the good not by any act on his part, but just by being. Because as I said, I'm a kind of Platonist. So I think, for example, we have value by virtue of the fact that we are made in God's image. We resemble God. He's supremely good. So we have a kind of deep qualitative value because of that. I think it's very difficult for naturalists to explain something like the Kantian claim that humans have this quality of dignity, which is some sort of egalitarian property. It's not based on intelligence or, you know, any other property that we have that can be differential. It's got to be something that is common to all humans. So anyway, those are just some of the way I think about this, but I'm under no illusions that what I say is going to sway your audience very much, but if they really want to know more about my thinking, I recommend my book Natural Science and Knowledge of God. And if they want to see what I have to say about morality, I have a book called God and Moral Obligation, both with Oxford University Press, in paperback.
Awesome. So my question, I when I think about obligation, I'm not sure how that fits into morality. Because when I think about morality, I ask, is something moral because I ought to do it, or I do it because it's moral? And I usually land on the second half, the second horn of the dilemma there. And I think that I ought to do it because it's moral, and something isn't moral because I ought to do it. Therefore, the oughts really don't seem to be intrinsic into morality at all. It just seems to be something that's added on. Once you have morality, then you can say you ought to do the thing that's moral, but it doesn't seem like oughts are in any way required for morality.
Well, goodness and badness are on my view. So an act is going to be good or bad, and it'll have those qualities regardless of how I think about it, or even, I mean, God will think about it rightly, of course, because he's omniscient, but it's not his thinking about it that makes it good or bad. He thinks about it the right way because he perceives its actual quality. But so, on my view, even without any divine laws, even if God had never given us any commands or laws, there would be goodness and badness in the universe. And but something new comes about when we have a lawgiver. So take the analogy of human laws. In Germany, on most of the autobahns, there's no speed limit. The legislatures have not given a law. That doesn't mean it wouldn't be good or bad to drive in certain ways and not in other ways. It still wouldn't be good to say drive 180 miles an hour on a freeway where most people are going much slower than that. So it would be bad to drive that way, but it's not against the law. And there's no one who could, let's say, hold you accountable uh, for violating the law, because there's no law to violate. So I think something new does come into the picture when we have a lawgiver, even if that lawgiver is perfectly rational and the laws are completely determined by the good, because not everything good is obligatory. There are lots of actions that might be good for me to do, but I'm not required to do. Uh, and there might even be some actions that are at least mildly bad that are not forbidden. You know, maybe it would be bad for me to not to brush my teeth for a day, but I wouldn't say that I've done anything immoral if I went a day without brushing my teeth. Uh, so anyway, but that's all discussed in my book, God and Moral Obligation.
So I don't understand what the obligations do exactly. Like, what is this adding in to the theory? Like, if I have a theory that there is a moral realist, so I believe morality is real, do I need oughts for anything? Like, what do these obligations accomplish
Well,
in the theory?
you need them if you think. I think that there are certain acts that decent people not only think are bad, but think are forbidden. So I'll put it this way: uh, uh, suppose I'm a utilitarian, which I'm not, and I think, okay, most 99.99% of the time it would always be bad and horrible to say bomb a school bus. But let's imagine a scenario in which there's some terrible government and they're doing all these terrible things, and the only way to get rid of them is to engage in some sort of terrorist bombing campaign. So maybe we can make a utilitarian argument for, in some weird scenario, one should ought to bomb a school bus and kill innocent children. My view is no, that's just a good person would not even consider doing that. It's forbidden. It's absolutely off the table, and one shouldn't even consider the possibility, and one doesn't have to. So part of the purpose of obligations is that certain actions, so to speak, are taken off the table. We don't have to even think about them because we know we're required either to do them or not to do them. And so it does add something new. Now, you may think that that's just not a part of your moral realism, but if one is a realist about moral obligations, then I think God provides a satisfying explanation. Now, suppose there were no God, what would I say? I think there are two options here. One could become a nihilist about obligations and just say, well, there aren't any obligations. Or one could say, well, the next best explanation might work. And the next best explanation, I think, would be something like Darwall's account, who says that obligations are brought into being by the fact that we humans hold each other accountable as part of the moral community. So we humans would be the ground in that case. We would replace God as the ground. But still, you need some ground for obligations, because I think obligations always have some sort of social ground. Even Kantians, in a way, agree with that. Christine Korsgaard says that voluntarism is still true because there has to be somebody to hold you accountable. It's just that it's your higher, better self that does that, on her view. There's a kind of duality in the self.
So we've been going for about an hour. I want to be respectful of your time. So thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it. It was a really pleasant conversation. Would you like to give a shout out to your books again so people can find them if they're interested?
Well, if they want, they might be interested. My last published book was a book called Kierkegaard and Spirituality. And one of the things that I do in that book is that I try to discuss very seriously what kind of spirituality would be possible for a non-theist, or at least somebody who's not a part of any organized religion. So that might be of interest to some people. I think Kierkegaard has some sympathy for that view. He was a great lover of Socrates, and I am too. So I call that Socratic spirituality. So, okay, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It was great having you on, and
Okay.
I'll talk to you later. You can close the screen whenever you want. I'll start the after show and talk to my audience.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
See you later. All right, guys. After show time. Discord. My Discord. My Discord. Open up the Discord. Screen share. This one. Share. Do that. I want to be on the right, left. I want to be on the left. And hello, Pillow. How's it going? What are you frustrated by? It's because I farted. That's why. Is there a way to pin block? Nope. Can't pin messages through Restream. Yeah, I think that to me, it seems like it's no different to just say that the fundamental nature of reality is a necessary or brute fact law of nature than it is just a God. I don't see how positing the God does anything there at all. Yeah, that's the part where it's like, see, I don't think we need to have a defeater for a belief like leprechauns or anything beyond science. I think simply the fact that science doesn't have evidence for it is a good reason to reject it. Beyond that fact, yep, for sure. Any other thoughts on the conversation or about anything else? We should make that like a role, the Mango followers. Someone else said they were going to pay for another thing with Mango too. I'm like, wow. Yeah. Yes, it's a thing in physics. It's one of the fundamental laws, kind of like the conservation of energy. Is a parsec a real thing, or is that a Star Wars number? I did the cattle run in 3 parsecs. Oh, I forgot. Forgot about that. I remember now. You have to click share screen and then share audio. That's how you do the thingy. All right. Now the stream can hear the words of the people in the Discord.
The people have a voice.
Yeah, the reason I brought up information theory was I think people get a little too hung up when you call morality a law of physics because they don't understand it could be something as like basic as information theory. You know, it doesn't have to be something like space, time, and gravity, all that.
Sure, yeah, those are just analogies.
Yeah.
The self-burning was the best part, though. Is it like when you were doing the leprechaun thought experiment? He was like, "Well, then, yeah, it would be unreasonable to believe in leprechauns," and it's like, there you go.
Yep. Those are always good moments. I've had a bunch of those over the years of doing YouTube where they make an argument like, yeah, that's what the atheists are saying about your religion too. There's one point where he said something like, forget what it was. Oh yeah, it was the point where all the different materialist views have good criticism of one another, and so you don't have to like posit a new view. You can just use the criticisms of the material. So I'm like, oh, you mean like religion?
Yeah. It's just every time he goes to that, it's just like, okay, I'm a pagan. What now?
That's a misspelled guest on that one.
So, I didn't really notice, but how are you? Okay, so at the beginning, he was doing the classic burden shift where he's saying that atheism is a positive claim. Um, do you handle that with like something else, or do you just say, oh, okay, well, I can just talk about this from an agnostic point of view?
Well, he was making the Plantinga's claim, which is a little stronger, that the belief in God starts as inherently rational. So both agnostics and atheists would hold a burden of proof because it's already rational to start as a theist. That's the Plantinga's position.
How do you even plant that position though? Because
Well,
to
it's kind of like,
me,
do you believe in the external world, right? Like there's a TV
right,
or a computer in front of you. And if somebody said, well, I'm agnostic to the TV, or I think that the TV is a figment of your imagination, they would hold the burden of proof because you're pretty justified in believing the TV is there, right?
well, yeah, but the TV is actually there to point at.
Right. So that's what he's claiming about God, is that those kinds of beliefs, like that there are other minds, that there's people in Australia right now, that there's a TV in front of you, those beliefs are justified, and anybody who denies them is going to hold the burden of proof. You don't, because you've already met it on your side. And he's saying, Plantinga is saying that God belief is like that, like the TV in front of you.
Only kangaroos in Australia.
Kangaroos are a lie.
Yeah, this sounds like kangaroo court.
What's the name of the evil koala? It's like Kookaburra something. It's like a myth in Australia of the evil koalas.
The chlamydia.
Chlamydosaurus.
Yeah, when you said that, I thought, well, I don't know should be the most reasonable default position. I just couldn't see how like the God argument is comparable to the TV.
Yeah.
I don't know. It was wild.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think God belief is comparable to sense experience of the external world or other minds.
Well, another good show.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Drop bears. That's the one. Drop bears. Anybody else got any questions, comments, things before I sign off? All right. Thanks, guys, for coming to the after show. Thank you for watching the stream, everybody in the stream. I'm going to get some coffee. I'll talk to you guys later.
Subscribe with Twitch Prime.
Yes. Subscribe. Money. Give me money. Peace out.